Hello everyone, I'm Hunter, and you're watching Unexpected History. If you're new here, welcome. If you're returning, welcome back. This video is part of Unexpected History's continuing series about unsolved and mysterious disappearances. Today we're going to take a look at one of the strangest disappearances in all of history, the Sodder children. Now, as Italian names, indeed the entire Italian language, are definitely not in my proverbial wheelhouse, I apologize in advance for the butchering of any names, etc. 77 years ago this coming Christmas Eve, a fire destroyed the Sodder family home in Fayetteville, West Virginia. George and Jennie Sodder, along with 4 of their children, escaped the blaze. The 5 other children home at the time of the fire have never been found, neither alive nor dead. Their true fates remain unknown to this day. In order to understand one possible reason for the disappearance of the children, you need to understand a bit of the parents' background. George Sodder was born in 1895 in Tulla, a town in the Sardinia region of Italy, as Giorgio Sodder. He immigrated to the U.S. at the age of 13 with an elder brother, although the older boy returned home immediately after clearing customs on Ellis Island. George, as he would later become known, never spoke at any length about his reasons for leaving Italy. First finding work carrying water and other supplies to railroad workers in Pennsylvania, then as a driver in Smithers, West Virginia, he eventually started his own trucking company, originally hauling fill dirt to various construction sites, but moving on to hauling coal mined in the area. That's when he met one Jennie Cipriani, the daughter of a shopkeeper in Smithers. Coincidentally, Jennie's family had also come to the U.S. from Italy when she was a young girl. Soon marrying and settling near Fayetteville, West Virginia, the couple bought a large timber frame home about 2 miles north of town. The trucking company prospered, leading to the Sodders becoming one of the most respected middle-class families in the area. George also became a very vocal critic of Italian dictator Benito Mussolini from the time of his coming to power until Mussolini's death, something that angered more than a few of the many Italian residents in and around Fayetteville. You'll understand why George's criticism of Mussolini just might be important in a bit. In 1923, Jennie gave birth to the first of their 10 children. By the time their last child, Sylvia, was born in 1943, Joe, their second oldest son, was serving in the military during World War II. About 2 months before Christmas 1945, a traveling life insurance salesman, upon being rebuffed, warned George that the house would, quote, go up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed, unquote. This thinly veiled threat, or warning, or whatever you call it, was given in no small part because, and again I'm quoting the salesman, the dirty remarks you've been making about Mussolini. Another man, supposedly seeking employment, took a moment to inspect the fuse boxes around the back of the house, claiming they would cause a fire someday. As the house had recently been rewired due to the installation of an electric stove, George was confused. The local electric company had declared the wiring safe just a short time before the man's declaration. In the weeks leading up to Christmas Eve, the older Sodder boys still at home noticed an unfamiliar car parked on the highway near the house, the occupants watching the younger children as they returned home from school. That fateful Christmas Eve in 1945, the oldest of the Sodder's daughters, Marion, surprised 3 of her younger sisters, Martha, aged 12, Jennie, aged 8, and Betty, aged 3, with some new toys she purchased with her pay from the dime store where she worked. The younger girls were so excited they asked if they could stay up a bit past their usual bedtime. Their mother relented, with the proviso that the 2 oldest boys still awake, Maurice, 14, and Louis, 9, remembered that the cows still needed to be put in the barn and the chickens needed feeding. Their father and the 2 eldest boys still living at home, John, 23, and George Jr., 16, were already sleeping, exhausted from working the farm all day. With those reminders about the remaining chores given, Jennie took her youngest daughter upstairs with her and went to bed around 10 p.m. Jennie was awakened around 12:30 a.m. by the ringing of the telephone. When she went downstairs to answer it, a woman unknown to Jennie asked to speak to someone whose name was unfamiliar to Mrs. Sodder. Jennie informed the caller she had dialed a wrong number. The woman responded with a, quote, weird laugh, unquote, as Mrs. Sodder later recalled. After hanging up the phone, Jennie noticed that Marion had fallen asleep on the living room couch, but there was no sign of the younger kids. Assuming they had made their way to their rooms in the attic, Jennie closed the curtains and turned out the lights, which the children had uncharacteristically neglected to do, and headed back to bed. About a half hour later, Jennie was once again awakened, this time by the sound of something thumping on the roof of the house, followed by a rolling noise. When no other sound came, she once again fell asleep, only to awaken after another half hour to the smell of smoke. Tracking down the source of the smell, Jennie found the area around the phone line and fuse box on fire in George's office. Waking up her husband, Jennie grabbed Sylvia while George woke John and George Jr. Jennie also collected Marion on her way out of the house. George and the boys yelled frantically for the younger children in the attic, but got no answer. Although they tried, they were unable to make it upstairs, as the stairwell was already fully engulfed. That wasn't the end of George's efforts to rescue his children, however, although those efforts were inexplicably complicated. Once outside, George sent his sons to fetch a ladder that was usually kept along the side of the house, but it wasn't in its normal resting spot, nor could it be found anywhere close by. When George attempted to use one of his work trucks to pull up under the window and climb up to it, neither of the trucks would start, despite being in perfect working order the previous day. While George and his sons tried desperately to reach the trapped kids, Marion ran to a neighbor's house to call the fire department. A passing motorist saw the flames and also tried calling the fire department. Neither attempt was successful, whether due to faulty telephones and/or phone lines, or were simply unable to connect with an operator is unknown. Also unknown is whether it was the neighbor or the driver who eventually reached the fire department from a phone further in town, but reach them they did. Unfortunately, it did little good, as the department had no central alarm system, instead relying on each firefighter to alert the next one in a phone tree, and they were severely understaffed due to the war. The fire chief, F.J. Maurice, was the first to arrive at the station, but unbelievably, he was unable to drive the fire truck, necessitating a further delay until someone who could drive the truck arrived. When all was said and done, firefighters arrived at least 45 minutes after being called, just in time to put out the smoldering embers. George, Jennie, and the 4 children that escaped could do nothing but watch as their house was destroyed, collapsing into the basement. The Sodders assumed their children perished. The firefighters, including a brother of Jennie Sodder, could do little more than sift through the ashes that were all that was left of the Sodder home. Chief Maurice informed George and Jennie that they had found no remains in the charred debris, although reports vary on this. Some say no remains, others say that there were some, but not many. Still other reports say the firefighters found remains, but withheld that fact from the Sodders to spare them the immediate agony and despair. Modern fire investigators have suggested that the initial search was cursory at best, although Chief Maurice believed at the time that the 5 kids had indeed died in the blaze, and that the fire was hot enough to cremate them completely. Chief Maurice instructed George to leave the debris undisturbed so a more thorough investigation by the State Fire Marshal's office could be performed. George and Jennie could no longer endure the site after 4 days, however, leading George to bulldoze 5 feet of earth over the site in preparation of creating a memorial garden dedicated to the children. A coroner's inquest was convened the next day, declaring the tragedy an accidental fire caused by faulty wiring. The 5 children were declared dead, with their death certificates being issued on the 30th of December, 1945. On January 2nd, 1946, a funeral for the children was held. Mrs. and Mr. Sodder could not attend due to their intense, soul-crushing grief, although their remaining children did attend. As the Sodders started to rebuild their lives, they gradually began questioning the official investigation and its conclusions. For example, their Christmas lights remained lit for quite some time after the fire began. If the cause of the fire was electrical, why hadn't the power to them gone out? When a repairman for the phone company came out to the property to install new phone service, he informed them that the phone line hadn't been burned through during the fire, as everyone thought. It had actually been cut. That was strange enough in relation to the fatal fire, but stranger still was where it had been cut. Someone had climbed 14 feet up the nearby telephone pole, then reached a further 2 feet out along the line to make the cut. The ladder George and his sons searched so desperately for the night of the fire, the ladder that was normally leaning against the wall, was found about 75 feet away from the house, at the bottom of an embankment. A witness on the night of the fire reported seeing a man stealing a block and tackle from the area near the trucks, which, if you'll recall, wouldn't start. That man was identified and arrested, according to some reports, and he admitted to the theft, as well as cutting the phone line, thinking it was the power line. No record of that man's identity has been found, however, and his reasoning for cutting any of the utility lines simply to steal a block and tackle has yet to be explained. While reading a newspaper article about a fire in a house very similar to the Sodders' house, which killed a family of 7, Jennie learned that the skeletal remains of the victims had been found. Disbelief flooded through her, so much so that she sought out an employee of a local crematorium, who informed her that human bones can survive a 2,000-degree fire for over 2 hours. far hotter and longer than the fire that destroyed the Sodders' house, which burned for about 45 minutes according to most accounts. In fact, parts of the house's tin roof had survived, as had many household appliances, still recognizable for what they had been. Jennie even went so far as burning small piles of animal bones. None were completely consumed. How could there have been no signs of the children's remains, as Chief Maurice had told them? Slowly, but surely, the Sodders came to believe their children might still be alive. Somehow, some way. If you'll recall, on the night of the fire, a strange phone call was received, which Mrs. Sodder found very suspicious later, given its timing just before the fire started. That phone call, however, was exactly what it appeared to be, a wrong number. Investigators had tracked down the woman, and she confirmed this. George had long suspected that his trucks had been tampered with, perhaps by the block and tackle thief, but his son-in-law, in a 2013 interview with the Charleston Gazette-Mail, said that he had come to the belief that George and his sons had flooded the engines in their desperation to save the children. Although this is certainly possible, it obviously cannot be confirmed today. While not offered up in direct support of the Sodders' growing conviction that the kids might still be alive somewhere, a bus driver who had been passing through Fayetteville around the time the fire began stated that he had witnessed something very strange. People throwing what appeared to be fireballs onto the roof of the Sodder home. If true, this could account for the thumping, rolling sounds Jennie said she heard that night. The spring following the devastating fire, while Jennie and George planted a memorial garden to their missing children in the dirt covering the remains of their destroyed home, their youngest child, Sylvia, found a small ball-like object made of a dark green material. George thought it resembled some type of grenade, or perhaps an incendiary device the Army used in combat. United States Army authorities later identified it as a napalm grenade. Eventually, the Sodders believed that the fire had started on the roof, but because George had buried the debris, there was no way to verify this belief. Over time, witnesses came forward with alleged sightings of the missing children. A woman who had been watching the fire burn said the children, or at least some of them, were looking out of the windows of a passing car. A waitress at a rest stop between Fayetteville and Charleston claimed to have served them breakfast on Christmas morning, although she couldn't recall how many adults were there with them. She also reported seeing a car with Florida license plates, but as it was a rest stop, it was possible the two were wholly unrelated. Another woman recalled seeing 4 of the kids at a hotel in South Carolina in the company of 2 men and 2 women, all of whom appeared to be of Italian descent. When the woman attempted to speak to the children, one of the men gave her what she described as a hostile look and began speaking angrily in Italian. Yet another person, a missionary, reported seeing the children in Cortez, Florida soon after the fire. When this sighting was looked into by a private investigator hired by the Sodders, the investigator stated with certainty that the children had definitely been in Cortez but were gone soon after. C.C. Tinsley, a private investigator from nearby Gauley Bridge, West Virginia, was hired by the Sodders to look into the fire and sightings of the children. In the course of his investigation, Tinsley discovered that the insurance salesman who issued that thinly veiled threat to George about the house burning and the children's destruction was actually on the coroner's inquest jury. That inquest ruled the fire accidental, although that ruling could be considered questionable based on the man's presence on the jury alone, apart from other suspected evidence collected since. Tinsley also uncovered rumors circulating around Fayetteville that Chief Maurice was telling people that he had indeed found some remains in the wreckage of the Sodders' house, a heart, despite telling George and Jennie that none were found. Maurice had secretly buried said heart in a metal box on the Sodders' property. When confronted by George, Maurice showed him where the box was buried, but when it was tested, it proved to be beef liver, which was never exposed to fire. Maurice did eventually admit to burying the liver so that the Sodders would cease their search for their children. Why he chose a particularly soft organ like the liver, unlikely to survive any type of fire, let alone one that was supposedly severe enough to destroy bones, is unclear. Nearly 4 years after the fire, George persuaded a Washington, D.C. pathologist, Oscar Hunter, to oversee an examination of the dirt and debris at the site of the fire. During what's been described as a very thorough search, Hunter and his team found a few artifacts, including the children's dictionary and a few coins, but the most important potential discovery they made was a few fragments of human vertebrae. Well, case closed and mystery solved, right? Not exactly. When tested by Marshall Newman, a specialist at the Smithsonian, he confirmed that the human lumbar vertebrae found were from the same individual, but that individual was 16 to 22 years old, meaning they didn't belong to any of the missing Sodder children, as Maurice, the oldest of those missing, was just 14 at the time of the fire. They also showed no sign of being exposed to a fire. Newman also thought it strange that the 4 vertebrae were the only bones found, given that full skeletons should have remained after a wood fire of such short duration. He came to the conclusion that they likely came from the fill dirt George had used to bury the debris. The findings of the Smithsonian regarding the vertebrae found in the debris of the Sodders' house made national news, prompting the West Virginia legislature to hold 2 hearings into the matter in 1950, which led to Governor O.K. Patterson and West Virginia State Police Superintendent W.E. Burchett to inform George and Jennie that the case was, quote, hopeless, end quote, and that it was closed at the state level. It was later determined that the vertebrae came from a cemetery in Mount Hope, but how they came to be on the Sodders' property remains a mystery to this day. The bones were returned to George in September, and their whereabouts are unknown. Over the years, the Sodders made multiple attempts to get the FBI to investigate, although FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover personally wrote a letter responding, proclaiming, and I quote, "The matter appears to be of a local character and does not come within the investigative jurisdiction of this Bureau," end quote. Hoover did add that the Bureau could and would assist if the local authorities made such a request, but the Fayetteville Fire and Police Departments declined to make that request. After the legislature hearings, however, the FBI asserted jurisdiction as it seemed a possible interstate kidnapping. 2 years later, the Bureau ended their investigation after following a plethora of unproductive leads. Authorities ceased any and all official efforts to find the children or determine their fates soon after the Smithsonian report, but the Sodders never gave up hope their missing kids were still alive and that they could someday be found. George Sodder spent most of the rest of his life searching for answers. He crisscrossed the country, investigating sightings anywhere they were made, such as St. Louis, Missouri, where a woman claimed Martha was being held in a convent. A customer in a bar in Texas overheard 2 people speaking about being responsible for a Christmas Eve house fire a few years prior. Those claims amounted to nothing. When a relative of Jennie's was reported to be caring for children that resembled his missing kids, nothing short of that relative providing absolute proof would satisfy George. In 1967, George and his son-in-law, Grover Paxton, traveled to the Houston area after a woman wrote to the family claiming that a man there, after having a bit too much to drink, revealed himself to be Lewis, and that he and Maurice were residing somewhere in Texas. Unfortunately, they were unable to speak with her, although police in the area were helpful in locating the 2 men, both of whom denied being the missing kids. Years later, Paxton revealed that George had his doubts about their denials, and those doubts ate away at George for the remainder of his life. Also in 1967, Jennie received a letter specifically addressed to her, with a Central City, Kentucky postmark, but with no return address. Inside the envelope was a picture of a gentleman in his early 30s who strongly resembled Lewis, who would have been roughly the same age if he did indeed survive. To further add to the mystery, there was a note on the back of the photo, which is now being shown on screen. The family then hired another private investigator to look into the picture and Central City, although that investigator seemed to be somewhat of a con artist, as he never reported back to the family, nor were they ever able to locate him again. Still, the picture gave them hope, so much so that they even had the photo enlarged and hung it over their fireplace. Perhaps it was wishful thinking on their part, but they seemed to believe it was truly a picture of their son, Lewis. The written note, however, perplexed them, as none of their children was named Frankie, be it their given name or a nickname. George later admitted to the Charleston Gazette-Mail that the lack of information was like hitting a brick wall. "We can't go any further." In another interview, he said, "Time is running out for us, but we only want to know. If they did die in the fire, we want to be convinced. Otherwise, we want to know what happened to them." George Sodder died in 1969, never knowing with any certainty, to his mind at least, what happened to his children. Jennie, along with their remaining children, continued searching for answers after George's death, with the sole exception being John, who believed they needed to accept what happened and go on with their lives, never speaking publicly about the night of the fire. Mrs. Sodder wore black for the rest of her days, staying in the family home and tending to the memorial garden until her death in 1989. After her death, the family took down the worn and weathered billboard that George and Jennie had put up in the 1950s along State Route 16 with pictures of the missing kids, as well as an offer for a $5,000 reward for any information that could bring any form of closure to the family. That reward offer remains unclaimed to this day. The remaining Sodder children and their children have kept the case in the public eye as best they can, continuing to follow leads throughout the years. Some older Fayetteville residents, as well as the surviving children, have put forth the theory that the fire was set after a failed attempt by the Sicilian Mafia to extort money from George. According to this theory, it's possible that the kids were taken by someone who knew of the plan and told them that they'd be safe if they left the house, and perhaps spirited them away to Italy. These theorists believe that maybe If the missing children were still alive, and aware of the survival of their siblings and parents, they stayed away and avoided contact to keep them safe, although I must admit this is probably the most far-fetched theory possible. Sylvia Sodder Paxton, the youngest of the Sodder children, who was in the house on the night of the fire, recalled the blaze as her earliest memory. She and her father used to stay up late trying to find out what may have happened. She was certain her siblings survived that night, and has assisted efforts to find them as much as was possible, in addition to publicizing the case until she passed away in 2021. While researching this case, with its myriad twists and turns, the empty leads, the alleged sightings, the clearly mishandled fire investigation, the weird anomalies with the trucks and ladder, and just the general weirdness of the whole affair, I've come to believe that the kids most likely died the night of the fire, although anything is possible. I don't find it likely that the missing kids would have stayed away for their entire lives for their family's safety, given that their abductors probably died years before their mother, but again, anything is possible. That being said, if you have any information whatsoever regarding the fates of the Sodder children, please contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI or 1-800-225-5324, or the Fayetteville, West Virginia Police Department at 304-574-0255. So what do you think happened? Did the kids die in the fire, or were they kidnapped by persons unknown, unable to return to their family? Leave your thoughts in the comments below and hopefully spark a discussion about what people think really happened. And while you're at it, go ahead and follow Unexpected History for more content just like this. Until we meet again, I hope your day is pleasantly unexpected.